Next up, we have Dan Small. He's going to introduce planting for habitat and what goes into that.
All right, everyone, this is going to be super brief, broad overview on how to transform, conventional row crop agriculture into habitat. Honestly, can't go into everything, but I'm going to focus on kind of just the basics on how to get started. The lower left here is basically the native seed mix that I use for our natural lands projects that I oversee. And most of what I'm going to talk about is from experience kind of overseeing some of these projects. I don't actually get to plant them, but I kind of help organize and line up contractors and deal with the seed mixes. And we've planted about 1,500 acres into habitat now on the shore. So I've had great success with these species. The deer don't seem to bother them. They're native. Some of the deer, sometimes deer do eat some of them, that's not true. But for the most part, when you're thinking about converting row crop agriculture, think about native species wherever possible. Obviously, there's a broad range of where you can plant from the shore up to the mountains. So some of these species aren't going to work for everyone, but keep an eye on that for your area. Seeding rates are exceedingly important, right? We're not going to seed all of these species at the exact same rate. That would not be it would be cost prohibitive. You can see I've got 3 species of native grass listed that we usually plant. Those are going to generally be planted at a higher rate, but you also want to be cautious on how high a rate you're going to put those grasses. They tend to be cheap, so it's easy to plant them, but over time they will become dominant at your site. For those that have done work with native species mixes before, you can see broom sedge is not on there. It's a great native clump-forming grass, but it comes in naturally over time on these project sites. So there's really no sense in spending $80 a pound, which is pretty expensive for a grass, when it's just going to come in naturally. So, and that's true for a lot of other species as well. So start off light with the grasses. As you know, it will come in over time, especially if you're going to introduce fire. To drill or broadcast, by far the most dominant way to plant these fields is with a native warm season grass drill that has several different compartments for all the different seed types. My number one recommendation, if you're thinking about converting land over to native ground, use a contractor that knows what they're doing, has a long track record, and actually if you can go see some of their sites they've planted, that would be a really good thing. I can't tell you how many landowners I've talked with that said, oh, we planted all these native seeds and nothing's really come up. It's definitely a skill on how to do it right, and very different from planting cover or clover food plots or sorghum or any of the other row crops. Broadcasting is a viable option, but you're going to have to increase the seed rate. So covering a lot of ground doesn't really work that well with broadcast seeding because you have to worry about predation of the seed from birds and rodents and other things like that. So generally you're going to spend way more on seed. So for smaller plots, it works really well, but if you're going to cover a lot of ground, using a drill is definitely the way to go. Timing, generally you're going to want to plant between February and May. We've had really good success during that window of time. We've done some projects in December and some in June, so timing is just one part of the component. Obviously spring weather is going to affect germination, and then obviously soil types as well. So there's a lot that goes in on whether you're going to have success or not. Personally, I love to get sites that we can plant into a cover crop. So that thatch, after it's burned down, is going to lay on the ground, provide some soil moisture retention on those drying periods as the seedlings are coming up. You can have really good success on ground that's been plowed and culti-packed, but if it really dries out, that will bake, and the ground itself is just going to be a lot hotter. So having some thatch down can be very valuable. Expectations for some of these plantings is obviously important, whether you're going to work with a private landowner or just in general when you're talking with the public, if you're going to convert some land. And that's going to vary too based on soils and obviously spring weather. So if you have some really good ground, you can expect pretty good establishment in year 1 or 2. But if you have sandy ground, you may be looking at 3 or 4 years. And so here last year, this is all from the same private farm, about 35 acres. Some of the angles are a little bit different, but it's pretty uniform across the site. Planted in April, that was a shot in May, and then in June, got a lot of rain and foxtail, fall panicum, and some of those annual species popped up. August, you can see black-eyed Susans in the photo, partridge pea, both species Monarda, a few species of the native grasses we planted actually all went to flower and seed, which is pretty unusual for the first year, so the soil was really good. You can see a lot of foxtail grass in there. We didn't do any management, we just let it be. And then this photo I took on the lower right just a couple weeks ago, it's lush with wildflowers and there's tons of nice grass underneath there. Some foxtail, but certainly not an issue like what we thought it could be from the last growing season. So that brings to like, what do you do in the first year to help establishment? And there's several different thoughts and strategies that you can employ, and that's going to definitely depend on what is growing in the field and what weed issues you may come across. So the top is a series of photos that were planted in Wicomico County. Actually, Lee, this is the side I was just talking about. We've got really good establishment. Those species you see on the left are all the things we planted coming up. Got a lot of rain. A couple months later, all the annual grasses really popped up. And so this landowner, in consultation with me, we decided to do some mowing to knock down those seed heads. So if you're going to choose to manage your first year establishment with mowing, plan on doing it 3 to 5 times during that season. So the idea is you don't want to wait to the end of the season when the grasses are this tall and all that biomass is going to smother everything if you just mow it off once. So unfortunately, if you've got some nesting wildlife out there, it's really disturbing. But if you mow just above the things you plant throughout the summer, you slowly build that thatch up as the natives are going to come up above. And she left an area there of kind of refuge because she was pushing rabbits and deer out of there, so she left some. So we'll have a little comparison to see how each management technique varied. And then in the lower right here, unlike the other site that had foxtail and fall panicum and among other things, this one really got taken over by crabgrass, which is pretty low. Lots of different species of crabgrass. Generally, it's pretty low, carpet forming, little kind of weak seed heads that you would have to mow once a week essentially. But as you can see, if we mowed that site, we would be mowing a lot of the natives that are coming up. So in that case, we used a grass select herbicide that knocked out all those annual cool season grasses. And you kind of see that those the grasses are starting to yellow off, but the native forbs and broadleafs are untouched. And then the other potentially big weed that comes in on some of these sites is horseweed. Unlike the grasses, you can get away with a really well-timed mow late in the season when that is in flower. So you mow it off once. If you get that timing right, it's not going to sucker by the end of the growing season. And if you reduce that seed load, you're going to have a lot less the next year. So depending on your weed issues, your management is going to vary. I also want to mention hedgerows for some of these larger project sites or shrub islands. And so these are some native species that tend to do really well. They sucker the deer. Other than rubbing them, don't necessarily browse them too hard. I like to plant hedgerows and shrub islands on a 3-foot by 3-foot spacing. For a hedgerow, ideally, you're doing at least 3 rows wide, but really 5 would be really, really great. For on the shore, at least, if you have some good ground, I think you can get enough cover in probably 5 years. So the natives kind of do grow slow compared to some of the non-natives. If you got sandy ground like we have on Chino farms where we've planted a lot of shrubs, you're looking at like 10 years sometimes, some of these things. But of course, brambles and things like that are going to fill in as well that add to that cover. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention about habitat configuration when you're planning these sites. And so taking into future management is an important aspect if you're talking about bigger areas. And so this is a state park that I'm working with in Millington in Kent County. The light green area there is going to be meadow this next year. It's about 70 acres. And instead of we wanted to add cover in there as well, and to complement the hedgerows that are already on site on that northern boundary and that kind of cross through the middle along some train tracks. Instead of putting random shrub islands everywhere, we lined them up with our management unit. So we've already kind of thought ahead how we're going to manage this. And there's 8 burn units that we're gonna do there. We're gonna kind of do every other one every few years, but instead of putting the islands in the middle of the burn units, we put them along the edge so we can just create our fire breaks in that outside of those islands. And obviously the burn crews are gonna like that because they don't have to burn out from those and they can just burn the field. And then lastly, this lower right-hand map is a private land project where we converted about 60 acres into habitat with some pollinator patches, and the rest of the field is covered in meadows. And those lines that you see there are hedgerows. And so not only did we take into management into perspective, but also took in the view shed. So the house there is a little bit elevated. Instead of putting hedgerows like perpendicular to the view, we kind of line them up so that no matter what, you're always having good views. And the one that's a little squiggly there is actually below the hill, so you can kind of see right over it. So this would also be important on public lands where people come and want to see, like, kind of especially if it's a big meadow, the kind of the nice view shed of. It's pretty rare to see open meadow habitat now that isn't all blocked off. So think about that when you're planting your projects as well. I know that was super fast, but 7 minutes.